Angry sports fans are left stranded as the All Blacks call off their international tour under threat of an Australian buyout of the team.
1,200 miles apart, but today the New Zealand and Australian share markets became
Australia
one.
declares war on Indonesia following the bombing of Darwin. New Zealand debates action.
Sporting history was made today as the Kiwis and Aussies launched a joint America's Cup challenge.
New Zealand's currency is no more. Today's currency merger means good night Kiwi, hello.
Australians vote yes on Republic.
Monarchists were crying into their royal Dalton as New Zealand declared itself officially a republic.
New Zealand Defence Forces will merge with Australian forces in an alliance announced
The exodus
today.
of New Zealand businesses to Australia hits an all-time high.
Almost 150 years after the first Australian Federation, New Zealand has finally done it. We're Australian.
Take yourself forward to the year 2050. New Zealand is now the 7th state of Australia. In 2050, the state of New Zealand is just like any other state in the Australian Federation. Our state government works out of Wellington, but our national government is strongly centralised and runs out of Canberra. Imagine that between now and 2050 we have slowly given up our national sovereignty and nailed our flag to the Australian mast, no longer being one, but now part of a larger whole. It could happen. In many ways it's happening already. There are advantages, sure, but there are also disadvantages. Will we still be us? Auckland is the largest city in Australia's 7th state, and here on the North Shore lives a typical 2050 family, the Smiths. Sue Smith is a doctor. She was born in 2007. She started life as a Kiwi but will die an Aussie. Her husband Joe once swore he'd rather die than become an Aussie, but he's still going strong and making a decent living in the tourism industry.
Whatever.
Their teenage daughter Rachel is in year 9 at school. She's a staunch patriotic Australian. And son Sam's spending his last holiday with the family before going to university in Melbourne. They're a typical Kiwi family. Ordinary people just like us, in 50 years' time. They're our children, our grandchildren, living a future that for us could be just around the corner.
The actual day-by-day stuff, you know what I mean? The teeth cleaning, going to the toilet, eating the cornies thing, I think that's going to stay the same. The sun's still going to be shining, the lawns are still going to need mowing.
We'll have absolutely the same economic currency. I think we'll have Sir Donald Badman on one side, heads, Sir Edmund Hillary on the others, tails.
It'll be a powerful country, able to project power and defend itself properly.
650 Porterhouse, 699 run state.
Being part of a larger, more vibrant economy would help us.
Well, it will give us a far superior cricket team for a start. I mean, that is not to be taken lightly.
We might even catch a little bit of the Australians' confidence, which is one of the great things about them as a nation.
We are, Australia and New Zealand, the most viable, cogent partnership in Oceania.
If you'd said 20 years ago that the Soviet Union was going to be dismantled and that Nelson Mandela was going to be president of South Africa, I'd have said you're bonkers, quite frankly. So anything can happen. I think it would need something really extreme to happen.
Well, what's the real downside? I mean, are we individually any worse off for that happening? Or are we just psychologically, upset by it?
We may not notice any immediate change. When we turn on our televisions, I think we will see a difference, because then they will be quoting politicians in Canberra rather than politicians in Wellington. Local news will tell us about what's going on in Wellington. The national news will be Canberra. That, I think, will startle people. They will be a little surprised to see that, and then they will notice that the voices are subtly changed. They're not New Zealand accents. They will suddenly realise, what have we done?
A merger or union with Australia is an absolute euphemism. It is a takeover, pure, simple, complete. Nothing more, nothing less.
The dominant party will rule, and the dominant party being Australia.
I mean, New Zealand will basically be Australia's little sister, and Australia will look after it and smack it on the back of the head occasionally and tell it to do things which are stupid and laugh when it does them.
4 kilometers to destination. Oh, we've only got 4Ks to go.
Oh, that thing's never right. You're going to be late. What time does it start?
Sam? What?
See when the parade starts, huh?
Very soon. So what are you going as? A galah?
What are you talking about? Dick, it's Australia Day. Everyone will be dressed up.
Well, I guess I'm just an old-fashioned Kiwi.
Yeah, nearly extinct.
Oh, it's horrible. It's horrible because suddenly we don't have any control anymore. I mean, even if we didn't have Australian police, it's very likely that the New Zealand Police College in Wellington would be closed down and our New Zealand police would be trained in Australia, which means they'd have Australian attitudes. Now, Australian police attitudes towards Maori and Pacific Island relations, I don't think we want that.
Australian police are armed and we're part of Australia. Our police will be armed too. That'll just be the way.
Good afternoon, sir. Just a random check.
G'day, you're a long way from the Gold Coast, aren't you, mate?
Joe. We've got it now. We've got an Australian firm running the prisons on a private contract. I really don't think that these scenarios are going to be so different to what we now have and what is developing.
All okie-dokie, mate?
Everything seems fine, sir. Have a nice day.
Same with you, Blue.
Don't you have guns in New Zealand? I would have thought that you knew what guns were, farming people and all that sort of thing. So, look, we're more concerned. You're worried about getting our police. We're worried about getting our brewery back. And you own one of our most significant breweries, my favourite beer, Swan, owned by Lion Nathan. We want the brewery back. Will we please have the brewery back?
Of course, we've been drinking mates with the Aussies for years. In 1901, when the 6 current Aussie states federated, we were involved in the discussions. We even considered joining and were written into the Constitution. We were almost Australian.
If it had happened in 1901, we would not, in our consciousness, we would not think of ourselves as anything but part of this big Australasia.
The door's still open. There's a number of clauses in the Australian Constitution that specifically say how New Zealand can join Australia if it so wishes. And the simple method is write a letter to the Australian Parliament and say you want to join. Those against federation in New Zealand came across to a number of the conferences, and the argument, one of the big arguments they put was there are 1,200 reasons why New Zealand can't join the federation or shouldn't join the federation, and they are miles. And I think that still applies today. But I think New Zealand is too far away to be in the minds of the Australian politicians.
There is a very real prospect before very long that New Zealand will be de facto a satellite of Australia.
The banking systems will move together, the stock market will move together, education will move together, and suddenly we'll realise that we're 95% there, so we'll say, yeah, let's be Australians.
Really, in New Zealand, I think if there was a referendum about federating with Australia, on your referendum voting form, there would be the question, do you want to federate with Australia? And there would be 2 boxes. You could either tick yes or you could tick fuck off.
There would be a huge backlash, I think, yeah. Not just from Maori, but from sympathetic Europeans as well.
There will be a Maori backlash against the notion of uniting with a racist state like Australia.
For a paradox, you may have the rednecks and the Maori nationalists on the same side.
But it is so palpably obvious to me that we belong in a political and economic union with Australia. I'm astonished that most people don't accept it. And in fact, I've talked to economists who, behind their hands, will tell you, yeah, it's got to happen.
Federation may have some advantages, but there is a danger in centralising control of our utilities and resources on the Australian mainland.
We'd lose our identity. We'd lose our young people. I think we'd lose our brains. I think that we would lose our infrastructure. We would be a backwater.
Oh, damn. Sue, where are you?
Yeah, I'm right here, hun. Not just us, the whole street's gone.
Oh, hang on. I'll just have a look. I think we've got a couple of torches under the sink.
Right.
Oh, crikey, Dick!
Don't know your way around the kitchen, eh?
Yeah. Rub it in. I'll call the power company, see what's going on. Yeah, hello, Joe Smith here.
If you ring the emergency services, if you want to get something done with your bank account or your utility, you may be in Auckland and calling a call centre in Christchurch.
It's getting to the point now where you dial an 0800 number and you speak to someone in Australia.
What? New Zealand? Where the hell are you? Victoria? So what happens next? You call someone over here? Or do I, wait for one of your technicians to fly over?
The reality is that foreigners do control more of New Zealand today than they have ever controlled in the past, except maybe the first 20 or 30 years. We have massively sold the equity of this country.
A lot of New Zealanders have felt betrayed by this constant selling off, this handing over of power to the Australians. And the ultimate price would be a loss of control of our defence forces.
For Australians, defence is the top priority in the Trans-Tasman relationship. It isn't for us in New Zealand, but it's going to become, I think, an increasing irritant in the relationship if the Australians feel we're not pulling our weight.
Australia's a lot more aware of the regional defence picture than we are, partly because it's closer to them. You take off from Darwin in your aeroplane and you're still unwrapping your sandwich and bits of Indonesia start appearing under the nose. If I was in the New Zealand Air Force still and we were swallowed into the Australian one, it'd be like all our Christmases had come at once. I mean, suddenly we'd go from flying 30-year-old transport airplanes to flying 3-month-old transport airplanes. We'd have an air combat arm that could do things. We'd have helicopters that could fly safely at night. We'd have all sorts of wonderful things that we've always dreamed of, and the Australians are quite prepared to buy.
The two of us together, if we keep proper equipment and proper interoperability, are quite a significant deterrent force.
And on the economic basis, there can be no argument that if we were to combine our economies and, let's say, combine our Army, Navy and Air Force, of course, if you have one central command with the same people, you don't have the duplication of here is a structure for our Army, there is a structure for their Army. Why wouldn't you have a structure in the middle for both? I mean, wasn't that us, wasn't that when I think about it, wasn't us Anzacs? Hasn't that already worked pretty well once?
In the Federation, if New Zealand were to join, there isn't going to be a New Zealand Defence Force. It's going to be an Australian or an Anzac Defence Force, which the New Zealand component of will go and do whatever is decided out of Canberra.
The Australian Premier announced today that he's prepared to send in ground troops to protect Australian interests. With talks breaking down, a non-military solution looks increasingly
Never thought it would get that far. Guess somebody's got to draw the line.
Well, someone you mean Australia. They've been wanting to get in there for ages. There's a disaster waiting to happen.
You'll laugh when I hear this.
It is possible that Indonesia and Australia will go to war. I don't think so. If that happens, then New Zealand becomes Australia's bolt hole, I think.
The Australian government refuses to rule out the possibility of a call-up to military service for those aged 18 to 35 from all 7 states.
What? Joe, that means Sam.
Holy shit.
For the past 2 weeks. But this latest...
I never signed any deals with the Australians. What do they mean, all 7 states? Not our son. What about university?
Sam. Joe, what are we supposed to do?
You would find that people from Dunedin were being press-ganged into helping defend a border that they really couldn't relate to. I mean, Darwin is about as far away from Dunedin as you can get.
It's a no-brainer. It's part of being part of the country. If that is national policy, you can't say everyone gets drafted into the army apart from people from Ponsonby. although that might be nice.
The Aussies can't save themselves any more than we can. If Australia was taken over, well, I would suggest that we learn to speak Indonesian double quick.
What do you know about defence? New Zealanders, I don't think that you know anything about it. At the end of the day, we're going to have to look after you there too. You don't have an air force. Last I heard, your air force was actually flying joyrides over the Blue Mountains and scaring the hell out of the colleges.
Defence isn't the only border issue we have to face up to in the coming decades. If there is conflict in Southeast Asia, at the very least we will have to make hard decisions about immigration and Southeast Asian refugees.
It is the teeming masses to our north, and you have Australia fundamentally uninhabited. 18 million people rattling around in the most enormous continent.
But how will these immigrants fit into our society?
Don't worry too much about the bench. Stead will just pile it up again.
And will New Zealanders have any control over where they're placed?
Come on, you. Sit down.
The latest arrival of refugees from Taiwan brings the number of Taiwanese refugees arriving in Australia to 20,000. The federal government's placement service announced today that refugees will be relocated in New Zealand and the Northern Territories. The government has promised to supply federal aid to New Zealand and the Northern Territories to assist with housing and emergency grants to the refugees.
New Zealand again. Why can't they bloody take some in Queensland or send them to Tassie or something? You get them all.
Joe. Overflowing refugee centres in Mangere and Otahuhu have been promised increased funding.
There's just no jobs for them here.
In 2050, sport has changed dramatically.
I mean, we wouldn't have the All Blacks anymore, would we? The All Blacks would be a provincial team. Well, that's going to change New Zealand fundamentally.
The All Blacks have lost their national status and are relegated to compete in Australian interstate competitions. Some older Kiwis are still loyal to the Silver Fern, but the younger generation tend to support glamour teams like New South Wales and Queensland.
Hurry up, Dad. Second half starting. It's comeback time. This is our stock and trade, the charge from behind. It's all about stamina, boy. No way.
Even under full political union with Australia, I think the All Blacks are one thing we're not going to give up. That's one of those cultural defining branding things that New Zealanders aren't going to let go of, and I don't think we have to.
Some say you would lose the All Blacks. If it happened, I say the All Blacks are already losing.
You're dreaming. You're wrong, Chief. Today's the day.
You say that every game, Dad?
Every game.
Being governed by someone from Sydney and told how to play our game would be ludicrous. They envy the New Zealand rugby scene. They envy the NPC because they don't have anything. What would it become? The Kookaburra Shield or something we're all playing for? And we sing Advance Australia Fair while we're doing the haka. It'd be a really lovely item, wouldn't it?
You're a traitor, boy. Where's your loyalty? This is New Zealand we're talking about. Oh, come on. Here we go. We're Aussies now. Get used to it. We're Aussies.
It may just be that New Zealand over the next 50 years can't afford the best players, and we just become a feeder nation to the richer countries who can afford the best players.
There's a danger for sport in New Zealand to be sucked into a great big void.
If you strip away silver ferns and black jerseys and Kiwis and rugby chants, and you look at the kind of forces that really dictate the way we live our lives in New Zealand, I would argue that they are largely economic forces, and to a large extent our economy is now controlled and managed from across the Tasman. So to some extent we are, economically at least, Australians already.
Well, economic merger is already quite far down the track. The New Zealand-Australia Free Trade Agreement in the 1980s set the pattern, and there's been a steady evolution of establishing a common playing field economically between the two countries.
And if you're voting for a government that has actually signed away or sold a large measure of a country's economic sovereignty, and you're becoming branch office New Zealand, then you don't have as much power as it might at first appear.
We've had no chance to debate integration with Australia. People treat CER and integration with Australia as an economic issue. It has huge social and cultural and treaty ramifications.
Oh yes, there's no way that an enterprise that is 6 times the size of another merges or unifies, they just take over.
And we need to decide whether that's the future we want now and not in 10 or 15 years' time when we are de facto a state of Australia, but it doesn't want anything to do with us.
In 1999, the per capita income in Australia was about $21,500 US per head. And in New Zealand it was $13,500 per head. So the gap is about 1/3 in terms of average incomes. Now on the projections, that gap widens out from 1/3 to 1/2.
I mean, in world terms, we're falling behind. We're getting poorer and poorer, and joining a bigger economy would definitely help fix some of the problems that we have.
When they decided that they would have a common currency, the euro, who wanted that in a hurry? The small countries, because they were the ones that know you cannot exist as a little wee country anymore. They know that.
Well, when people talk about a bigger economy, they mean that there would be some sectors of the New Zealand economy that would benefit. And basically they would be people who export to Australia. But only 20% of our exporters export to Australia. The other 80% wouldn't get any benefits whatsoever.
The Australians will be offended at this, but frankly it's too small to have much impact at all. It will be diddly squat. I mean, Australia likes to think it's a big player, but it's actually not. It's big geographically. It's not big in world trade terms. It's not big in economic terms.
Put us together, we're still in the population of Greater Los Angeles.
If you had a winning game plan, you'd ask yourself, well, what fits our strategy best? And you wouldn't choose Australia. So it's a sloppy second-rate decision.
And our focus has got to be on the world. Why would we want to be the poor country cousins, you know, of Australia, the guys who turn up at the door in short pants and get sent away with lunch money?
But it goes beyond lunch money. There's a special New Zealand way of life many of us would still like around in 50 years' time.
The thing that really gets me about this argument is that it's always about money. You know, the reason that people moot something like union with Australia, whether it be monetary or, you know, or about sovereignty, is because, oh, it'll be great economically, but I don't want to live in a culture and a country that is all about economics.
So if we debate a common currency in this country, we have to recognise it's not an economic issue. It's a social issue. It's an issue about whether New Zealand becomes the backwater where all the problems remain, and Australia gets to cream off all of the benefits, all of the skills, all of the investment, and washes its hands of the economic refugees that creates.
Every day, hundreds of Kiwis and Aussies cross the Tasman. Most of these are tourists or business travellers. The problem is that for every 10 of us that swell their population, only one returns home to New Zealand.
Well, we're already losing from New Zealand. I think the word is hemorrhaging. A politician used a little while ago. Mind you, they're into that sort of colourful language. But we have lost 440,000 Kiwis, and the most of those, they talk about a brain drain. The Kiwis that I've met in Queensland, mostly, are go-getters.
We supply them with skilled people, and they supply us with bugger all.
Why are there 450,000 New Zealanders in Australia? Because everything's better here. I suppose because prior to there being 450,000 New Zealanders in Australia, there were 350,000 New Zealanders in Australia, and the other 100,000 got lonely.
When they get there, they pay about $2.5 billion in tax every year, and none of it comes back to New Zealand. The flow is increasing. There was about 40,000 left over the last year. The New Zealand taxpayers paid for the training of these people, and they don't derive any benefit from them. This is New Zealand's foreign aid program to Australia.
But we'd just like them to pull their weight, and there are just not enough restaurants in Bondi for them to be waiters.
Arguments aside, If the number of New Zealanders locating permanently across the ditch continues at its current rate to 2050, it could be a case of last one to leave, turn out the lights.
I would have thought that New Zealand firms under a federation may well say, let's pull out of New Zealand and put our investments in Australia, because it's going to be a lot easier for now to operate across the Tasman where our biggest markets are. But what about all those New Zealand professional firms which for years have been servicing them, like their accountants and their lawyers and their auditors? That work goes to Australia, doesn't go to the New Zealand firms anymore. So there is a cost.
It's going to be a service economy. It's going to be people who cut down trees, not people who make furniture. The skilled people are going to leave. You're not going to have the high-paying jobs here. You're not going to have the companies here.
The $100,000 a year job has really been ripped out of the New Zealand provinces already. I fear it would be ripped out of the major centres as well, that those jobs would go to mainland Australia. Who would be left in New Zealand? It might well be the poorer people and the elderly.
Here's the lunch stuff.
There aren't any bananas in there, are there?
I didn't know you knew about bananas and boats, Dad.
Oh, you know, it's your birthright. You just kind of know about fishing.
Howdy.
G'day, how's it going?
You off out for a fish then?
Oh, yes. We're biting today. I can feel it.
And what species are you after? Snapper?
No, I wouldn't say no, but I guess I'll take anything that leaps on the hook.
Yeah, but what species are you licensed for?
Licensed? I'm not going to drive them. I'm going to eat them.
Where you been, mate? You know you're required to hold an Australian Marine Department recreational fishing licence.
Look, I'm just going to go 100 metres off the wharf and dangle a couple of lines in the water with my son. Yeah?
You are required by law to hold a licence for any fishing within Australian Marine Department waters. Now, it takes a working day to process an application for a fishing licence. So if you haven't already sorted out a licence, there won't be any fishing today.
If we joined with Australia, we would be the irrelevant periphery.
Policy would be run out of Canberra by an economic bureaucracy in the Australian Treasury, which is absolutely remote from Australia, let alone New Zealand. It sits there in Canberra in this beautifully manicured little capital. What do they know about the New Zealand economy? What do they care about the New Zealand economy? Not much, I suggest.
When you're in third form, everyone beats you up, but particularly the fourth formers, because they've spent the year before being beaten up by everyone. So they're quite vicious. So I reckon New Zealand would be pretty much third form, and the other states would all be fourth formers, and we would get a hiding.
I think we could do very nicely here in New Zealand. For a start, we could cut back our enormous bureaucratic infrastructure here in New Zealand, which is crippling this country, in my view. We could downsize Parliament, downsize the big state departments.
But it would mean that the bureaucracy that mattered on some really important issues to ordinary people would perhaps become more remote. And so that would present problems that people would actually have to go to Canberra to lobby for the issues that were of concern to them.
Australia is 5 times as big as we are. Any merge, even under favourable conditions, they're going to have 5 times as much voting as we do.
We would be reduced to becoming Australia's Hawaii. We'd be a cheap amusement park. The Australians have no real sense of New Zealand's identity and the differences of our culture and the fact that we recognise Maori and Maori rights. And, you know, Australia would treat us in a completely chauvinistic way. Yeah, we'd become Australia's Hawaii, no doubt about it.
We've probably got a little more substance than that, but being taken seriously by Australia and the Union would be no given.
There is a very real danger that Māori could end up being the tourist icons. Dancing brown, dusky maidens in grass skirts is already the only image that many Western Europeans see of Māori people when they come out here on their quick pit stop.
I think we give our stuff away. We're the biggest bargain on earth. You know, you've got the Kiwi peso continuing to go down the toilet. You know, we don't want German package tours coming into New Zealand. They're a waste of time.
Sold out for the whole weekend.
We the tourists. Everything's always full of tourists.
No, they're not due. I don't sit at home all day.
Sitting at home all day sounds great. I've got to go to work. You want to swap?
No.
See you at 8. 2 tour groups today. You should see them throw their money around. We should be in retail. See ya.
See you later. Have a good day.
We bust our butt to get as many international tourists in here with their lovely yen and their American dollars as we can possibly get, because that is, that's a large part of what we sell to the international environment. Come on board. We want as many tourists as possible. So if New Zealand were to become a great tourism destination for a lot of Australians, tell me, get to the problem part.
New Zealand currently hosts hundreds of thousands of tourists a year. If numbers increase at the current rate, by 2050, tourists could well outnumber residents.
We would be waiters and second cooks and drivers of tourist buses.
I suspect New Zealand will be a low-wage economy. It would turn into a service industry largely welcoming tourists until we got fed up with them.
We have got to become exciting, interesting, aloof, unusual and desirable. We have not got to be a begging bowl. I don't want to be Tasmania.
Tasmania, where's that?
You'll become a South Australia or Tasmania. You won't become a New South Wales or Victoria.
Tasmania is part of the Federation. It's got political representation in the Senate and in the Australian House of Representatives in Canberra, and yet it has been turned into a welfare colony.
The wages in the Tasmanian workforce are higher than they are in New Zealand. Welfare benefits are higher. Education subsidies are higher. So you can either say that New Zealand doesn't want to become another Tasmania, or you can say, what would Tasmania have been like had it, like New Zealand, not joined the Commonwealth in 1901? And the answer would have been much, much poorer.
For a mindset to shift to see New Zealand as being even as worthy of consideration as Tasmania would require a huge movement on the part of not only Australian politicians but of Australian citizens.
The only time we call you is when we wonder whether or not you're still there. Hello, calling New Zealand, you're still there.
Even the Treasury papers examples, they say that increasingly economic activity will concentrate in Australia. That's where the jobs will be, the investment will be. Cities like Auckland and Wellington and New Plymouth will be the periphery. If you see the consequences of that move on to Treasury saying, well, not all New Zealanders will lose out, because you have to distinguish between citizens and residents. And the citizens who move to Australia might do okay. The residents who stay in New Zealand might lose out. We have a pretty horrifying future.
I think that New Zealand would become, if we federated with Australia, a place where older people perhaps would like to go to.
Statistics suggest that by 2050, 1 in 4 New Zealanders will be retired. That's 25% of us living on Australian-controlled pensions.
There might be a tendency to say, okay, well, we're part of Australia now, we'll just sort of sit back and let Australia do it, and we will just become a huge retirement zone or something like that.
We tend to beat ourselves up a bit about being a tourist centre and about being potentially a place for retirement, but that's something we do well. We have natural assets in that direction, and I think we're going to become more comfortable with that because it's an excellent foreign exchange earner.
could happen, and you could become another version of God's waiting room, which is what we say of places like Surfers Paradise, where the elderly cash in their chips, go to a place where the real estate's cheaper, and live out their dotage. That would probably not be a good outcome for New Zealand if you finished up being the twilight home for affluent and geriatric Australians. We get all the bright young people and you get all our oldies. In fact, I've made a phone call to my travel agent.
Are we relying on possible federation with Australia as a fallback position? And will our children, like Joe, thank us for gambling with their future?
If you've chosen to become a state of Australia, you've probably done so out of failure. You have been sliding relatively, you get sold this false promise, become a state of Australia and it will all get better. But you'll just continue to slide.
Becoming the seventh state of Australia would give us access to the resources of the larger Australian education system. But at what price?
Mum, can you help me?
Sure. What's up?
It's history. We're supposed to write a story about what it'd be like to arrive at Australia when it was first discovered. The teacher said we could write it from an English person's point of view or an Aboriginal.
Well, what about Māori? You could write about it from that point of view.
It's not part of the history stuff, Mum.
It's an interesting question. I don't know. Would New Zealand perhaps adopt the New South Wales curriculum? After all, New Zealand for a very brief period was governed from New South Wales many, many years ago. So that might happen.
What book are you reading? Dreamtime. Convicts. Ed Calley. Kathy Freeman. That's not us.
We're learning about Aboriginals. Oh, it's really interesting.
Yeah, I know, but there's all the New Zealand history you should be learning. It's important.
Why?
What representation would New Zealand parents have? Would they have a New Zealand Parents and Citizens Association which would somehow lobby the New South Wales government on education matters from 1,200 miles away? It's all very difficult, isn't it? It's all incredibly difficult. And flowing through all of these questions is the loss of control or the loss of sovereignty.
It would have to be recognised if we ever went into any political union with Australia that we are a very different society, that we have a significant Indigenous population, and that there would be issues relating to that Indigenous population that had to be looked after, had to be protected.
Hell, in Australia, they still won't even apologise. The government won't even apologise to Aborigines.
The good relationship, the relatively good relationship that exists between Indigenous people and Pākehā New Zealand will be replaced by the sort of tension that you see in Australia. And we know what that would create because Māori are much more organised than Aborigine. They're politically conscious. They wouldn't tolerate it. It would lead to considerable tension.
The centralised education system has also led to the rationalisation and closure of many New Zealand universities, which find it hard to compete with the resources and exciting campus life that many of the mainland universities offer. Like most New Zealanders who want further education, Sam has decided to move the 1,200 miles across the Tasman to study.
I don't think you're going to have enough room for all these, Sam.
Everyone says it's really cold in Melbourne.
And for many parents seeing their children leave home for the first time, the mainland seems a long way away.
What are you going to do with an arts administration degree again?
Oh, look, let's not start that again.
Administer the arts, Dad. It is a job. Anyway, engineering's the only thing left in Auckland. You know how crap I am at maths. Wouldn't be able to get a building to stand up straight.
I think a lot of New Zealanders might say, look, I walk down Willow Street and I walk down Queen Street in Auckland and I see all of the banks are owned by Australia. And I walk and I see record stores which are not owned by us anymore. I think a lot of New Zealanders might actually say now, enough is enough.
The world that we live in is its diversity. What I hate about the world that I see we're going to be increasingly living in the future is a uniformity. You know, I don't want to live in Mac culture. I don't want to live in Ocker culture. I would like to live in a community that is distinctive and proud of the fact that it's distinctive.
Dad, come give us a hand.
No, we're on your own now, mate.
We need to have that debate now. We can't afford to leave that debate until 2030 when we're so far down the track that there is almost no way out, and we certainly can't leave it to 2050 where we have been effectively abandoned by the rest of the world, thrown back on our own resources and have none to call on.
One is called Australia, one is called New Zealand. We present to the world, however, the same, you know, we have the same defence forces, the same navy, the same air force, separate sporting teams, same currency. Couldn't work better. Why wait? Let's do it soon.
And the argument would have to prove that in actual fact it's not going to affect our silver furnishness, basically. And if they can do that, well then we probably would. But when you come up against that silver fern, and your kiwi and your flora and fauna, and that's when they'll start thinking a bit more deeply about it.
We are New Zealanders, and my heart says, hey, do you want to be considered an Australian? And I've grown up in New Zealand. I'm a fifth generation New Zealander, and the idea of actually being an Australian now is not what I would choose to be.
I'm born here. My ancestors immigrated here. I'm proud of what they did, and hopefully it'll carry on into future generations. So therefore, I'm a New Zealander. Why would I want to call myself anything else?
It's sort of like asking whether you want to give away having your own family. And I mean, you wouldn't dream of doing it as a family, but that's what we would be doing.
If you want to nail down something that's unique about New Zealand, it's things like McLaughlan. Australians have great art, great literature, possibly more of it than us, but they don't have what we've got. We still have a unique character, and it's not a bad one.
Look at Australia, the most over-governed country I've ever seen, with the state politics, the federal politics. New Zealand, development will come from the edge because we're free, we're liberated, you know, we have an incredible attitude to get stuff done.
When you meet New Zealanders overseas, they're always talking about when they'll be able to go back there. You know, people like Neil Finn. I mean, Neil Finn's a really famous guy. He gets really famous. What does he do? He moves back to New Zealand. That's the sort of place it is. And federating with anyone would take that special, particular character that New Zealand has, that character that you want to return to, be it when you're older or when you want to bring up your children or something like that. So that's what I'd say. Leave New Zealand as it is because it'll always be there to go back to.
But at the end of the day, we could wake up and find in 2030 or something that we were now very close to a full union with Australia. We were perhaps where the European Union is now. At that point in time, you have clearly on the table the question as to whether to go that last final step.
If we continue to lose confidence in our ability to manage the economy in particular well, then we may actually go to Australia really through a loss of self-confidence.
I would go no further than the Tasmanian city of Burnie, on the west coast of Tasmania, where every big industry is now shut down, moved to the mainland. The people of Burnie will hate me saying this, but my impression when I was there a couple of years ago was it's just been written off as a welfare colony. No one's got any answers about investment anymore, or big investment to keep the jobs. And you're seeing almost second and third generation of unemployment there. That is, kids are unemployed, the parents have barely ever worked. They're stuck there. Can't sell the houses, no way out. So you stay there on welfare. But that would be my worst case scenario. That haunts me, actually. It really haunts me, because I can almost see that happening in New Zealand if it gives up everything. and becomes part of Australia. And I say give up everything because I mean that for it to happen it would take a vote in New Zealand or some sort of referendum for people to say yes. But they shouldn't be sucked into that.
There's nothing wrong with being number two and having to try harder. And New Zealand does try pretty bloody hard, I think.
So long as we are prospering as a nation economically and so on, I don't see any need for New Zealand becoming part of Australia or any other country.
We love you. You are our brothers and our sisters, and we are in the deep South Pacific, and we are all together here. Come with us. Walk with me. Vote for me. I'm 6'3". Good night, New Zealand.
Bugger them.
This program was made with